again, I want to welcome everyone and just take a moment to review the purpose of our workshop today. So today we're going to provide you an overview of the draft CAPTI plan. You're also going to hear some perspectives from interagency partners who participated in developing the draft plan. And then the bulk of the time will be to provide an opportunity for the participants to ask questions and learn more about the draft plan. So today our focus is on providing information. CALST is going to be hosting a second workshop that's scheduled in mid-May, and that's going to focus on, that will be a format that focuses on hearing your feedback. So we'll take a moment to go through our agenda. So in just a moment, we'll have opening remarks from Secretary David Kim. Then we have about a 30-minute presentation. That's going to be followed by our panel and question and answer, and we will wrap up by 11 a.m. So with that, we are going to get started, and I'd like to turn the program over to Secretary David Kim for his remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Joan, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see you, although we don't really see you, but we know you're here, so thank you for joining. Today is a big day. We are releasing the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, also called CAPTI, and as most of you know, this has been under development for the better part of the past year and a half, and we have done it in collaboration with many of you. So first and foremost, thank you for your constructive input. We are grateful that so many organizations and individuals have taken the time to engage in this effort. In fact, your ideas were the basis for many key strategies and actions that make up the plan. I also want to briefly acknowledge the many state agencies that have been working with us to develop the draft plan: Caltrans, California Transportation Commission, Office of Planning and Research, GoBiz, Strategic Growth Council, Housing and Community Development, and the Air Resources Board, among others. It has truly been a collaborative effort within the administration. So I want to give a big shout out to all of our state partners for their leadership and contributions to this effort. Now, as you've heard me say before, we are in the middle of a climate crisis, or climate emergency, as the governor describes it. All of you know about the recent washout of Highway 1 in the Big Sur region. That was caused by massive amounts of debris and mud flowing downhill, remnants from the Dolan Fire burn scar. If that's not evidence of the climate crisis, I don't know what is. These climate impacts are here now, they are severe, and they are likely to get worse. And I think you all know the data point. More than 50% of California's greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. So all of us in transportation need to be part of the solution, and we've got to do more. And time is of the essence. We've got to tackle this now, not 5 or 10 years down the road. That means taking bold action to create a more resilient and sustainable transportation system in the face of these increasingly severe climate impacts. And that's why the governor issued a couple of executive orders. The first one was in September 2019, and more recently, September 2020. And these executive orders develop a path forward for the transportation sector to commit to climate action, to dramatically reduce GHG emissions, and to halt the worst effects of climate change. Now, the executive order from last fall, as you might remember, requires all new cars sold in the state to be zero emission by 2035 and commercial truck sales to be zero emission by 2045. Vehicle technologies are clearly a key strategy, but even under the most aggressive scenarios for adoption of zero emission vehicles, as well as a transition to cleaner fuels, the fact is that we simply cannot meet our climate goals by relying exclusively on vehicle technologies alone. It's got to be combined with efforts to encourage greater mode shift, reduce our dependence on driving, and reduce VMT. The key is to use all the tools in our toolbox. And so This brings us to our current effort, the CAPTI effort. And just to refresh your memory, the first executive order in 1919 directs CalSTA to leverage state discretionary transportation funds to reduce GHG emissions in the transportation sector. It also calls attention to the importance of walking, biking in transit, and focuses on projects that do not increase passenger vehicle travel. So CAPTI is a holistic framework that prioritizes transportation investments, and it communicates a statement of intent for the state's new direction in supporting sustainable transportation. So you're probably asking, what exactly is the new direction you're talking about? It's all about making sure that all Californians have multiple options when it comes to travel choices. It means getting people where they need to go in a timely, convenient, seamless, and affordable manner, and to provide sustainable transportation choices that are competitive to driving. It also means acknowledging and addressing the fact that our current transportation system benefits some and burdens many others. There are winners and losers. And a good example of that is frontline communities that bear the brunt of severe pollution from freight facilities. The plan also means leveraging investments in transit, ZEV deployment, and active transportation, all of which are well positioned to help advance a robust economic recovery. And as we look to economic recovery, the key is to do it in a way that will reduce the deep inequities that exist in our system. Now, how we do this and what the solutions look like may vary in different parts of the state. And that's why CAPTI takes a flexible approach in identifying solutions while setting common goals. I think it's also important to emphasize that our commitment to a fix-it-first approach, as reflected in SB1, will not change. I want to assure you of that. Maintaining state of good repair of our highways, roads, and bridges is of the utmost importance to the governor, and that will continue. At the same time, if we are going to truly live up to the vision of a fix-it-first approach, if we're serious about fix-it-first, we need to be more thoughtful when it comes to expanding the system. And so here's a question that's important to think about. If we invest in projects that ultimately increase long-term maintenance costs without providing an outsized benefit to climate, equity, and health goals, is that a trade-off worth making? That's a question I posed before, and I'm going to continue to raise it with all of you. And I hope you'll keep it in mind as you look at the draft document and share your feedback. Now, I know many of you are dying to know if the plan we're talking about will mean that the state will no longer support highway capacity expansion projects because of their environmental impacts or the possibility that they'll induce more vehicle travel. And I want to be clear, this plan does not mean the end of any one type of investment. Instead, what we're suggesting is for all of us to put our heads together to develop a more holistic approach when we think about investment priorities. In fact, if the question we're asking is, do we widen a highway or not? I would submit to you that we are asking the wrong question. I believe a more appropriate question is, what exactly are we trying to bring the traveling public in terms of benefits, and how do we do it in a way that minimizes climate impacts? If we ask ourselves that question, especially when planning new projects, I think we'll sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, conclude that highway widenings are usually not the best long-term solution. But in some instances, they might still be our best available option. In fact, I really like what Mayor Pete, Secretary Pete recently said. This is what he said, quote, "There might be some areas where a road needs to be wider, but there might be some areas where roads need to go on a diet too," end quote. Well, we're not going to spend time talking today about road diets, but I think his point here is that road expansion may be legitimate and justified in some circumstances. And there are other situations where road expansions are not the best solution. And I agree with him. Context is everything. Now, I want to acknowledge that change is hard. This work is anything but easy. But I believe all of us can meet the demands of the climate crisis. We have the ability, and it is clearly within us, to take a new direction and to put forth solutions as we work our way through truly uncharted territory. And that's exactly why we're asking for your input and feedback on the draft plan. Now, I think the mission before us is pretty clear, and that's to advance a plan to meet our ambitious goals and to do it in a collaborative and pragmatic way within our existing funding frameworks. What will it take for all of us to think in a creative, pragmatic, and thoughtful manner when it comes to investing in projects that provide clean, equitable, and safe multimodal options for all Californians? That is the challenge before us, but I do want to emphasize that we cannot do this effort alone. And so we're excited to continue partnering with all of you to come up with a new and better approach to transportation planning and programming that will make it possible for us, the transportation community, to achieve ambitious goals and to do our part to be part of the solution. So for today's workshop, we're going to provide an overview of the draft plan, and we're also going to hear from various state agencies that were involved in the development of the plan. And we know that the plan involves a lot of detailed and nuanced actions, and so we wanted to focus today's workshop on clarifying questions. And what we're planning to do is host a follow-up workshop next month after you've had a bit more time to reflect on the draft, and that session will create space for feedback and, very importantly, dialogue involving all of you. And I really greatly appreciate your personal involvement in this effort, and I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you for your time and attention. And with that, I will now turn it over to Darwin Musavi, Deputy Secretary for Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination, and Darwin will give an overview of the draft plan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Secretary Kim, for that introduction and for helping set the stage for this really important effort. I appreciate your ongoing leadership on this work. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Looks like we have almost 300 participants today. Glad to see all the interest and again, appreciate all of the work that you all have done to get us to this point over the last year as we've worked on this plan. So many of you who've been engaging are familiar with the various aspects of this plan, but I wanted to take some time today to share kind of the latest and what's been included in the draft plan that's now gone public, and to get everyone kind of up to speed on this effort. So real quick, building off of the introduction that Secretary Kim gave us, this effort really is born out of the governor's call to action in Executive Order N1919, where he asked CalSTA to leverage our state transportation dollars to help meet our climate goals. As the Secretary mentioned, this really means tackling the other side of the coin beyond just zero emission vehicles and looking at how we reduce our dependence on driving by increasing transportation modes and options for the traveling public, and coming up with more innovative strategies that encourage people to shift from cars to other modes of travel. So that was the charge that we were given, and the mission that we've taken over the last it's been, I think, almost 18 months since the release of this executive order to put together what we now call the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. The executive order specifically called out $5 billion of transportation infrastructure spending as the dollars that should be leveraged through our efforts. And those programs that make up that $5 billion are listed here on the screen. As you'll see, many of these programs already invest in multimodal options that help get us to that reduction in dependence on driving that the executive order calls on us to work towards. I'll also note that many of these funds have very different statutory reasons for existing and aims. And this effort is not aimed at changing any of those statutory directions of these programs, but looking within those programs and within those existing statutes to come up with meaningful ways to get better climate-oriented outcomes out of the different programs. And I should say that, although this effort is very much focused on climate change, the reduction and need to reduce our dependence on driving is also key and critical to both our health outcomes and equity outcomes across the state. So we're looking at these programs and the planning processes that go into these with a health, equity, and climate lens to come up with various ways to get us closer to our goals. In terms of the process and timeline that we've gone through to kind of get to this point, I won't go into detail here, but as you'll see, we started back in early 2020 with stakeholder outreach. We had a survey where we got over 70 different organizations to respond on input with our guiding principles and give us suggestions for potential action items and strategies. We held a workshop in the fall, a public workshop in the fall, and we have attended various standing meetings and had engagement with many of you over the last year or so, which has gotten us to the point of having a draft plan to release, gather input from our stakeholders. And I should say that our outreach is far from over. I think the most meaningful opportunities to weigh in on the specific actions are still ahead of us here, as we look at both going to the upcoming CTC meeting as well as the joint CARB CTC HCD meeting in April. And then, as Joan and Secretary Kim both mentioned, we plan to hold additional workshop opportunities to engage all of you before the end of the public comment period. So the additional workshop will be aimed at getting public feedback, and then there's also an opportunity for public feedback in writing between now and May 4th. And the goal is to adopt a plan by July 15th of 2021, which is the date given to us by the governor in Executive Order 7920. All right, so shifting from kind of process to what's in the document, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what CAPTI is and what it covers. First and foremost, it's really a holistic framework for aligning state infrastructure investments with our state climate, or state transportation infrastructure investments, I should say, with our state climate, health, and equity goals, built on the foundation of the Fix It First approach listed in SB 1. So I think it's critical to reiterate that what we're talking about here is not realignment of any of our funds beyond the statutory intents of those funds. It's really looking within our planning processes and programming processes and looking for opportunities to better prioritize amongst the various projects that we're all working on, and to work together to make improvements to how we engage our communities in these projects, how we plan for these projects, how we deliver these projects to get better climate outcomes. We have a suite of proposed actions in the plan that are around state transportation planning and programming, as well as mitigation activities, and that help align those different activities with the CAPTI framework. I'll touch on this a little bit more later in the presentation, but it's important to note that those actions call on various state agencies to take various actions, particularly CalSTA, Caltrans, and the California Transportation Commission. In the case of the California Transportation Commission, the actions listed in the plan are recommendations to the CTC for consideration. So I just wanted to clarify that piece. Also, the approach that we're taking is very much keeping in mind the need for all areas of the state to benefit from these changes, and acknowledges the need for a range of solutions in different contexts. So, you know, to CalSTA, a successful implementation of this plan would not necessarily result in shifting of geographic distributions of the funds across the state, but instead really looking to all of you and the work that you're doing across the state to figure out, you know, how can the state support and invest in the most health, equity, and climate-oriented projects that you all are working on amongst the suite of efforts that you are moving forward. And lastly, I want to say that this is a living document because, you know, we see a great need to kind of adapt and pivot and modify our approaches as we move forward and figure out, you know, what actions are working and which ones are not. We're certainly open to learning from this process and building off of the guiding principles that we've set in the plan to come up with, you know, continue to come up with new approaches for actions and strategies to implement that vision. So as I've been mentioning, the plan includes what we call a set of guiding principles that help create a vision for how transportation investments should be prioritized to meet our climate, equity, and health goals, as well as a more detailed set of strategies and approximately 30 actions, which are kind of outline our initial areas of work that we plan to undertake to help work towards those principles. Key to those principles are these three of the 10, which are the principles oriented towards the clean transportation options and solutions that we think we need to expand on. So we would like to prioritize investments towards building integrated statewide rail and transit networks, investing in safe and accessible bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, as well as investing in infrastructure for light, medium, and heavy duty zero emission vehicles as part of larger highway investments and transportation investments that we undertake. In addition to those investments, there are other key principles that we need to have in mind when we approach this work. One of those is and a very important one, is strengthening our commitment to social and racial equity by working to reduce public health and economic harms and maximizing community benefits. So this is really about finding ways to incorporate in our planning and programming decision-making how we think about equity impacts. Also, you know, a key and important principle is safety. In particular, we're interested in focusing our efforts around safety on reducing fatalities and severe injuries, working towards that Vision Zero goal. And as we think about and talk about climate change, it's important to also acknowledge and work towards having a much better understanding of the physical climate risk that climate change poses to our system. So not just working towards reducing emissions, but also preparing for the impacts of climate change that are already being felt today on the transportation network across the state and by our communities. This work, a critical part of this work is also being mindful of the projects that we invest in that have the potential to significantly increase passenger vehicle travel, and working to, as Secretary Kim put, really weigh the trade-offs between what those projects bring in terms of benefits and what their costs are, and work towards not promoting projects that significantly increase passenger vehicle travel. Additionally, we want to focus on promoting compact infill development while protecting residents and businesses from displacement. You know, how you do this through transportation investment is really about thinking about our infrastructure as supportive infrastructure for land use planning and thinking about the impact that transportation infrastructure brings on land use patterns and having that be a much more integral part of our thinking. We need to work towards developing a zero emission freight transportation system. So I mentioned earlier the need to invest in zero emission vehicle infrastructure. It's not just about investing in that infrastructure, but thinking about that investment kind of from a systems perspective of how do we get to a point where we have a functioning zero emission freight transportation system, and that needs to be an integral part of the planning work we do moving forward. And finally, the flip side of the infill coin, our transportation projects not only have impacts on urbanized land uses, but can have impacts on our natural and working lands. So working to understand those impacts and protect our natural and working lands is also key. So in terms of tackling those 10 guiding principles, we've come up with a list of 7 strategies and areas to focus on where we think through these 7 strategies and the actions we've outlined underneath each one, we can really start to move the needle on those 10 guiding principles. So I'll go through each of these and talk about some of the actions and what they could potentially look like under each of those strategies. And this is really where we're really interested today to answer your questions about these strategies and actions, and then moving forward at our upcoming workshop later in April to get down to the details with all of you and receive your feedback on those actions and whether they're the right ones and how to make them work and implement the guiding principles that we've laid forward. So the first strategy is around cultivating and accelerating sustainable transportation and innovation by leading with state investments. And what this is really about is, these actions are oriented towards looking at our programming actions and the various opportunities we have to directly invest in projects and coming up with opportunities to prioritize amongst those projects in a way that helps lift up and create more opportunities for investment in sustainable transportation. So we've outlined some ways that we think we can do that across some of the key programs that were mentioned earlier in reference to the executive order. Next, we have a set of actions around the strategy of supporting a robust economic recovery by revitalizing transit, supporting ZEV deployment, and expanding active transportation. So the idea here is that as we come out of our current economic situation, given the impacts that have been felt by the transit sector, given what we've seen in terms of the importance and realization of the key importance of active transportation in our communities and renewed importance during this pandemic, there's really a need to think about how do we come out of recovery by focusing our investments and our opportunities for new investments that we get in areas that help build upon kind of our key transportation needs. And so we've outlined a set of actions that we think will help us do that, particularly looking at strengthening our zero emission vehicle investments in our transit programs, looking at how to better support and increase funding for the active transportation program, and coming up with pathways for investing in and building out our state rail plan as an example. Also, to the point we made earlier about needing solutions that work everywhere, we've recognized through this process that rural transportation solutions are not necessarily always well represented in statewide funding programs, and our criteria doesn't always necessarily prioritize funding in those types of solutions. And so we want to have some key discussions with all of you to identify pathways to improve competitiveness of rural transportation solutions in our programs, particularly around transit and active transportation. Our next strategy is around elevating community voices in how we plan and fund transportation projects. So the actions outlined here, one key one I'll highlight is that we're really interested in establishing a transportation equity and environmental justice advisory committee and creating a space to have our partners who work on environmental justice and equity issues to have a seat at the table to be able to discuss and advise the transportation agencies on planning and programming decisions and really have input into those processes as we move forward. Our next strategy is around advancing state transportation leadership on climate inequity through improved planning and project partnerships. And what this set of actions is really about these are mainly actions that Caltrans would undertake, and these are actions that would help set up and really start to align the types of projects that we plan for, support, sponsor, and fund with the climate action plan for transportation infrastructure guiding principles that we talked about earlier. So these are kind of various actions that Caltrans would undertake to align those planning efforts with where we need to go in the long term. All right, next strategy. Let's see. Strategy number 5 is around supporting climate resilience through transportation system improvements and protections for national working lands. This is really about, as I mentioned earlier, institutionalizing climate risk assessment as a common practice in our various transportation project work. And a key question we've gotten through this process is, well, what about actual planning for adaptation and components of projects to address climate change? Is it enough to just talk about risk assessment? And addressing climate change directly in our projects is certainly a part of where we're going here. But a key starting place is having an understanding of that risk to be able to then set ourselves up to both understand the monetary implications and needs to really address a lot of these issues and to better understand how to prioritize our projects as they face climate change impacts. Strategy number 6 is around supporting local and regional innovation to advance sustainable mobility. This is really an acknowledgement of the great work that's happened at a regional and local level through sustainable community strategies, creation and implementation, and the ongoing work that's been happening for years on a lot of what we're talking about here, and trying to come up with some key actions where the state can be more supportive on implementation challenges that local and regional agencies have had. Particularly we're talking about coming up with and working on new mechanisms for mitigation of VMT from transportation projects as an effort to help with SB 743 implementation, and then also help work and partner with many of you who've been working on local and regional roadway pricing mechanism implementation. We really want to have a convening about how the state can be supportive of implementation of those various strategies and what our role needs to be in that. Key things to highlight there. And finally, our last strategy around strengthening transportation and land use connections is really kind of aimed at simultaneously addressing the need for climate action and to reduce VMT, while also understanding that we are in a housing crisis and need to address that as well. So how do we make sure we coordinate our transportation and land use decisions and work towards those common goals together versus kind of in conflict with each other? And so we've identified some actions here that we think can help us move in that direction. So with that, I wanted to quickly talk about the upcoming engagement opportunities before we get into the rest of today's workshop. But as we mentioned earlier, today is really aimed at a Q&A session, giving you all this information on the plan that just came out last week, allowing some time for questions from you all to get clarifications to help assist you in informing your opinions about the plan and your comments over the next couple of months here. And we'll be accepting feedback, public feedback until May 4th on the plan at the email address listed here on the screen. And between now and then, we plan to hold additional a workshop opportunity for public feedback, as we mentioned in late April, as well as we'll be presenting at the CGC and joint CGC CARB HCD meeting on the draft plan as well. And as mentioned earlier, hoping to finalize the plan and plan to finalize the plan by July 15th. So that's our timeline there. And with that, I will turn it back over to Joan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darwin, for your informative presentation. We've gotten a few questions in the chat about the slides being available and the posting of the webinar. And the materials will be available. We'll first be doing ADA remediation before we post the materials, but they will be on the CAUSTA website a few days after today's workshop. So you'll be able to review and take a closer look at the materials. So now we're going to start with our panel. So we have a number of representatives from the different agencies, and Darwin, if you could pull up the next slide, and I can do some brief introductions of the panel. Great agency representation here. The speakers will be going in the order that they're listed on the slide. So to get right to it, and they're each going to take about 4 to 5 minutes and share their perspectives on the plan, and they all participated in its development. So we're going to start with our first speaker, and that is Jeannie Ward-Waller.
Can you hear me, Joan?
We are ready for you, Jeannie.
And
Thank
see
you.
me? Okay, good. Well, hi everyone. I'm excited to be here. Very excited for this CAPTI effort and to actually see the action plan released and start discussing the actions, the specific actions in detail. Caltrans has been deeply involved and really are, as an organization, very excited about this work. And I was just scrolling back through the actions this morning and noticing that I think we are listed as a lead agency or a supporting agency in all but a small handful of actions. So we have a big role, and I think we're already working on a number of the activities. I also just wanted to mention that we released our updated strategic management plan, I think just last week. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please, you can find it right on our homepage of our website. Please take a look. I think what you'll see in that document is some very close alignment with the CAPTI plan and also with the CTP 2050, our long range plan. So there's just really good synergy with this plan and with a lot of the other efforts that Caltrans has been working on and is making very strong commitments to. I just want to mention a few specific actions that I think are really critically important to Caltrans, and some of the things that we are already working pretty hard on, but a few things that will be upcoming that we'll really be investing a lot of energy into. One of those things is the action around the ITIP and looking for opportunities to excuse me for talking in acronyms, the Interregional Transportation Improvement Program, looking for opportunities for Caltrans to really expedite some early project phases of new projects that are aligned with the CAPTI goals through the ITIP. And that will be an effort that we'll be undertaking over this year. So that's a great opportunity for us to move forward some new projects that may be more innovative solutions and different types of solutions than the department has really championed in the past. Also implementing the Cal ITP program, the Integrated Travel Project. That is a special project that actually lives in my program within the department and is one of the most exciting things that I think Caltrans is working on really to benefit specifically transit agencies around the state and their recovery post-COVID, bringing folks back to transit and making transit much more seamless and user-friendly. On the equity front, I want to just point out the action around developing a transportation equity index. That is something that our new Caltrans Office of Race and Equity, or we call it the CORE office, is already beginning to develop some conceptual ideas. I think there'll be a lot of collaboration with OPR, also with the Natural Resources Agency, and Cal APA with the Cal EnviroScreen tool, through our work on coming up with an equity tool or index that helps us really focus on prioritization of transportation investments. Darwin mentioned just about all of the actions under strategy S4 will require strong leadership by Caltrans. So those are really important to us, specifically around improving state planning and project partnerships. Again, there's mention in there of the Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, or the ITSP, which informs the ITIP that I talked about. Also the State Highway Strategic Management Plan, the SHSMP, which is out in draft version right now, our corridor planning efforts, our freight mobility plan, and also the nominations, project nominations that Caltrans puts forward and champions for SB1 competitive programs, federal programs, and other opportunities for funding. So we'll spend a lot of time on those planning and project development activities. And finally, I just want to mention one of the actions related to pricing, and specifically convening a roadway pricing working group with our local and regional partners to collaborate, identify barriers and opportunities and ways the state can support utilizing pricing as a strategy on our system to manage demand, to help us address our climate goals, also to operate the system more effectively. That one is closely related to one of our key recommendations in the CTP 2050, and we anticipate getting that work group going within the next couple of months. So hope to have many of you on the webinar today participate in that and be involved in that work going forward. So with that, Joan, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. Our next panelist who will be speaking is Matthew Yozgat from the California Transportation Commission. Good morning, Matthew.
Morning. I hope I'm audible. Okay, so thank you, Joan. So my name is Matthew Yozgat, and I'm the Deputy Director of SB1 Programming here at the California Transportation Commission. And I've been one of the active members of the CAPTI Interagency Working Group, as kind of elaborated through this presentation. Many of the strategies in the CAPTI support the Commission's commitment to climate change, equity, active transportation, public health, and the reduction of congestion through innovative strategies designed to encourage people to shift modes. We're encouraged that the CAPTI identifies several near-term actions and investment strategies within the transportation sector that enhance clean transportation, sustainable freight, and transit options. And we're committed to ensuring that it continues a fix-it-first approach to our transportation system, as promised by SB1 and restated in Executive Order in 7920. The CAPTI preserves that all actions related to the CTC would be introduced into the appropriate CTC program guideline developments process And we look forward to working with our stakeholders as we move forward through the upcoming SB1 program guideline updates and our equity advisory roundtable processes. A few of these strategies are outlined in strategies 1.1, 1.4, and 3.2, and I'll elaborate a little bit. For example, in strategy 1.1, it would lead to the prioritization of congested corridors projects so this is in regards to the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, projects that enable travelers to opt out of congestion. As evidenced by the recent Solutions for Congested Corridors program, projects are increasingly utilizing multimodal approaches to reducing congestion or allowing travelers to opt out entirely. This strategy will explore that a bit further in the next cycle of the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. Strategy 1.4 will maintain zero-emission vehicle infrastructure investments within the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, where statute allows. Exploring zero-emission vehicle infrastructure is vitally important to meeting the state's climate change and sustainability goals, and the Commission is committed to seeing that through in the next cycle of the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. And Strategy 3.2 will lead to a strengthened and expanded coordinated, targeted technical assistance on state transportation funding programs by both the Commission and Caltrans. With the limitations of holding in-person trainings and workshops during the existing COVID-19 pandemic, without any idea of it letting up anytime soon, the value of virtual trainings has really taken shape and will continue to be utilized as a means for offering technical assistance on tools, methods, and practices for competing and participating in the different transportation funding programs. The need for staying connected and expanding participation beyond our regular stakeholder groups is vitally important to achieving equitable outcomes within our programs. Those are just some of the strategies that the CTC is thrilled about included in the CAPTI, and there are several others. But at this time, I wanted to conclude my segment and say that we look forward to hearing from stakeholders today and at future workshops, and that concludes my comments.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Next, we have Jennifer Gress from the California Air Resources Board. Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us in this effort, and I'm happy to be here. We support CAPTI because it aligns well with many of the state's key climate initiatives, including the Climate Change Scoping Plan, the Transition to Zero Emission Vehicles, CARB's Mobile Source Strategy, and the SB 375 Sustainable Communities Program, just to name a few. As Secretary Kim outlined at the start, California has ambitious goals for air quality, climate, transportation, and housing. And this plan identifies investments and program changes that we must make to better achieve those goals. CARB has been aggressive in adopting regulations that require cleaner vehicles and equipment. But cleaner vehicles are not enough. We need to provide more transportation options and reduce the need to drive to reach our climate goals. The CAPTI is a much needed step in this direction and is consistent with recommendations CARB has made to strengthen efforts to meet state and regional GHG reduction goals. In 2018, CARB issued a report evaluating progress meeting GHG reduction targets established by the SB 375 program. This report, known as the SB 150 report, revealed that greenhouse gas emissions from BMT are going up, not down, as we hoped. A critical test of progress on BMT reduction is whether investments have shifted in ways that improve transportation choices, especially those that make it easy for people to drive less. The report found that the overall ratio of dollars planned to be spent on roads versus other modes of transport has shown little shift since 2008, when SB 375 was first enacted, and that we needed better alignment of state funding to support state and regional climate goals. Specifically, our 150 report identifies improving alignment of transportation funding programs with the state's health, equity, economic, conservation, and climate goals as one of 8 priority areas to increase and sustain progress in this area. And the development of the strategies in the 150 report relied on input from MPOs, academics, builders, environmental, public health, and equity advocates, state and local practitioners, and public stakeholders. CAPTI is a critical element of the state's response to this issue. Many of the recommendations in CAPTI align with recommended next steps in the 150 report. Specifically, the investment framework for CAPTI identifies guiding principles for investments that are expected to help achieve VMT reductions, such as investing in networks of safe and accessible bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, promoting projects that do not increase passenger vehicle travel, and promoting compact infill development while protecting residents and businesses from displacement. I'd also like to highlight the plan's guiding principle on strengthening our commitment to social and racial equity by reducing public health and economic harms and maximizing community benefits. It's important for all of our agencies to infuse our programs with equity and to involve communities in our decision-making processes. Finally, CAPTI includes a mechanism for tracking progress, which is critical for successful implementation. We fully support the proposal to use the joint meetings with CARB, CTC, and HCD to track progress every year and ensure continued agency coordination. These joint meetings also provide a public venue for stakeholder engagement and transparency. I'll just sum it up by saying that transportation dollars are one of the biggest levers that we have to affect change. And this plan will draw on billions of dollars to help us move towards a cleaner transportation system, less dependence on automobiles, and more sustainable communities, all with a stronger focus on equity. This is what California needs. Thank you. That concludes my remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. Our next speaker is Josh Rosa. Good morning, Josh.
Morning. First, on behalf of the Housing and Community Development Department, I just want to extend great appreciation to CalSTA for involving HCD in this very important process. HCD is very energetic and serious about our role in mitigating climate change and adapting to it. Much of our work in CAPTI's implementation will be focused on Strategy 7, of course, focusing on land use and transportation connections, but we also look forward to working with the Interagency Working Group and hearing from stakeholders to advance actions throughout the plan, because we recognize the challenges and the solutions are intersectional. Executive Order N1919 in particular focuses on reducing VMT, which has as much to do with the destinations as it does with the conveyance between them. So our department has to be thoughtful about how housing production influences travel demand, as well as mode and other related activities determining VMT. And we're focused on advancing VMT reduction goals right alongside our housing production goals in a positive sum way. For us, this means recognizing a great complementarity between housing affordability and VMT reduction. Part of this means recognizing location as a factor of a home's affordability. A home isn't affordable if you can't get to it affordably. And the other part is working with transportation agencies and climate agencies at all levels to meet communities' need for livability. This is crucial because for decades, coastal and urban communities have produced more jobs than they have homes. In fact, from 2010 to 2018, some regions produced more jobs than homes by a factor of 4 to 1 or even greater. And this forces workers to live far from their daily destinations, increasing their VMT and their household costs related to travel. Housing cost burdens in California are very well known. Our department's most recent statewide housing assessment found almost half of all California households are paying more than 30% of their income on their rent or their mortgage. But at the same time, the average household in most counties is also paying more than 20% of their income on transportation. This combined transportation and housing cost burden exceeds an acceptable share of household spending because it diminishes families' ability to pay for food or utilities or healthcare or other vital expenses. And this double burden disproportionately impacts low-income households that have the least disposable income and are the least capable of telework. The effects of COVID-19 exacerbate these inequities. As parts of our professional workforce are transitioning to mass telework, we risk leaving behind those workers who cannot telework. Those who work in retail, food service, hospitality, or other service industries that typically offer lower incomes will continue to have to travel to their work sites. So we see in this action plan a tremendous responsibility and an opportunity to promote more affordable homes closer to where Californians need to be every day. and our department is committed to working with other agencies and stakeholders to see that through. So thank you. And with that, Joan, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Josh. And our next and final panelist is Egon Terplin from the Strategic Growth Council. Good morning, Egon.
Good morning, Joan, and good morning, everyone joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, there's some familiar names on that, and really a pleasure to be a part of this. And like Josh mentioned, I do want to commend Calsta and my other co-panelists today for really being a part of a process that I think was really interagency and really thoughtful. And I know there's been some questions of have there been conversations throughout the state? And very much there really have been throughout this. Of course, can't get to everyone, but I think the development of CAPTI has been reflective really of a principle of reaching out and speaking to people throughout the state. So I just wanted to kind of sum up with a couple of words. So Egon Terplin with Strategic Growth Council and the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which is really the long-term planning arm of the state, but really that takes an interagency and an integrated approach. And I think CAPTI is extremely reflective of this. And you heard that across the comments with a focus on equity and climate and the land use issues and climate resilience. And for us, at least in the OPR-SGC world, we're really interested in that integration of land use and transportation, climate risk, but also having an approach to the economy that's about a sustainable and inclusive economic development and an economic recovery coming out of COVID. And we heard from Secretary Kim about the need to work in a creative and a pragmatic manner, and thoughtful as well, of course. And I think what we see in CAPTI is reflective of a set of core values that we as a state have. That we are focused and committed to tackling the climate crisis and promoting public health, safety, improving the quality of life. A lot of these shifts in how we're going to live and grow are about actually improving quality of life, bringing an equity lens. We heard from Josh about affordability and this idea of inclusive economic development. And I just wanted to make a few points sort of in closing about this. The first is that we recognize that there are many ways to get to these goals, right? That we actually, in some ways, one size does not fit all. And we actually have to tailor some of these needs to the distinct parts of the regions in California. However, we have firm commitments as a state, right? We have these climate commitments. And so CAPTI is coming out of that. But I think the idea that we can work in a collaborative way across the boundaries of the regions to really implement these ideas is critical. And that was very much the spirit of Regions Rise Together, the initiative of the governor that launched just about 2 years ago, was really working with regional partners. Second point I wanted to make is that CAPTI is also kind of one piece of the puzzle. And there's a part of it in the very beginning that says that there's many other efforts that relate and continue to support these principles. Some of them are mentioned in CAPTI around climate resilience, but another one that's sort of reflective and related that we're leading at OPR with the Labor Department is around a just transition roadmap, which is really thinking about the future economy that we are creating in California, and one that leaves no region behind and no workers or communities behind, but we work in a collaborative and collective way as part of a transition. And so the executive order that's referenced in CAPTI around the expansion of zero emission vehicles, also inclusive of that is this understanding of how do we have a just transition for all regions in the state. But there's also many efforts at the regional and the local level. And Jennifer Gress talked about the partnership around the sustainable community strategy and the implementation of SB 375. And that's been an effort, many of the folks involved with CAPTI and others of really trying to strengthen the state and regional partnership in that incredibly important piece of legislation and structure. And so that is a way how these ideas get put into place, right? Are the decisions that are made at the local level, the investment decisions that are made at a regional level, and kind of working in a collaborative way with the state. The third point I want to make is that really the framework, the ideas that are underlie CAPTI are actually really about giving people more options, about improving their quality of life. And to the extent that there's a shift in how we're going, it's actually trying to kind of allow people to live and work in communities without the reliance so much on the automobile, but giving them more opportunities. And some of the opportunities are also going to be in new industries and kind of the growth of high road jobs and higher quality jobs as we make a shift to a carbon neutral economy over a period of time. And so you see in CAPTI a little bit of a reference to that of how do we prioritize some of our future state and federal transportation dollars, but bring a high road lens to it. And that means that we want to make sure that as we invest dollars in places and communities, we do so in a way that is both strengthening communities, not dividing them as we have historically sometimes in transportation, but also that they are producing quality jobs and long-term jobs. So we very much have a kind of high road lens in our economic development work. And finally, I just want to kind of also link CAPTI to a longer term sort of trend or set of thinking. And one of the kind of deep in the planning code language of the state is something we at OPR refer to a lot, are the state planning priorities, which actually were written down in 2002. But CAPTI is very consistent with that. And it's very, very simple. It's 3 ideas. We really want to focus a lot of our growth in existing communities, in infill areas, and strengthen those. Point 1. Point 2, we also want to make sure we protect natural and working lands and strengthen the agricultural economies of the state and continue to promote those areas. But then 3rd, as we continue to grow outward from our existing communities, do so in an efficient way that's aligned with infrastructure investment, that saves the taxpayer dollars. And I'm quoting from the state planning priorities. Those words were written down in 2002 when climate wasn't the forefront concern written in state code, but it's very consistent with how we're doing things today. And I think CAPTI is reflective of that and starts to get us to some very specific and tangible ways to move forward. So I really think we are incredibly supportive of this. We've been participants in this process, and we're really excited to continue to work with you all about implementing it, but also recognizing it's a living document. And so continuing to work and evolve over time with this. So with that, thank you for listening to all of us, for being a part of this, and excited for your questions and discussion in the next phase. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Egon. So now we're going to open the question and answer period. We've already got a few questions that
the success that we talked about that we're looking for is continuing to work with all of you. I've seen there's many questions that folks submitted today that we weren't able to address. But one common theme and that I've seen through a lot of the questions that I think is really important to remember is that the implementers, the ultimate implementers of a lot of these projects, the state might be the funder in these cases that we're talking about, but this is really about local and regional actions and work that you all have been doing for, many of you have been doing for decades, and we're looking to kind of align our investments to support that great work on the ground. So I just want to appreciate and acknowledge and thank all of you for the great work that you've been doing, and to say that success relies on you all to kind of continue to engage and help provide input into this process as we move forward. So real quick, I will put up this slide just to remind folks of opportunities coming up. So we will be following up with everyone who signed up for this workshop today to invite you to a future workshop. We're still working out the details of what that will look like, and working with our partner agencies to figure that out, but it will be geared towards receiving, it will not be a Q&A like this, but it'll be geared more towards receiving feedback and comments from you all. And so we'll be working on setting that up for before the end of the comment period. Also, as others addressed, we will be having discussions, including next week at the CTC meeting, followed by the joint meeting, CTC CARB ACD joint meeting at the beginning of April. And we're also asking for public feedback in writing at the email address provided here, which will also be provided to you via email as a follow-up by May 4th. As a follow-up to this workshop, we're also going to be planning a frequently asked questions document that will address a lot of the key questions that we discussed today, as well as others that we think are really important to clarify that may not have come up today. So that'll be all in an FAQ. There'll also be a recording of the presentations in this workshop that will be provided on our website, which is also where you can get the document itself if you haven't read it already on that web page posted here. And so you'll get this information in a follow-up email as well. But with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today. and that concludes our workshop. Thank you.